Picture the embalming chamber of a royal necropolis. The air is thick with resin and incense, torches flicker against walls carved with prayers, and at the center lies the body of a queen. You, the embalmer, have sworn your life to sacred precision, to preserving flesh so that the soul might journey unbroken into eternity. But tonight, the order you've been given is unlike any you have heard. You are not simply to preserve this queen. You are to alter her in ways that break the oldest laws of Ma'at, the divine balance that governs the world. Her body is to become not a vessel for her own soul, but a demonstration of power, of fertility, of cosmic control that belongs not to her, but to the pharaoh. This was not fiction. It was the logic that animated one of the world's most enduring civilizations. To the ancient Egyptians, sexual energy was cosmic energy. It was creation itself, the echo of the first union of gods that brought order out of chaos. Every act of intimacy was potentially a prayer, every climax a conversation with the divine. For them, the body was more than flesh. It was an instrument to keep the Nile flowing, the fields fertile, and the kingdom alive. The pharaoh, as both king and living god, bore the heaviest burden of all. His potency was not his own. It was Egypt's lifeline. If the Nile failed to flood, if crops withered, if famine loomed, priests and commoners alike whispered, had the pharaoh failed his divine duty? His virility was tethered to the cosmos itself. That belief created enormous pressure, leading to increasingly extreme public and private displays intended to prove the ruler's divine vitality. But there was a darker side to this theology. For what if a pharaoh, or his kin, did not meet those expectations? What if their flesh was flawed, their potency uncertain? The solution, in the logic of Egypt, was not denial but modification. The body could be perfected, reshaped, prepared to meet divine standards even if it required mutilation. Centuries later, when Western archaeologists rediscovered Egypt, they stumbled upon these truths and recoiled. In the prudish morality of the Victorian era, the notion that sex was sacred was already scandalous. But the evidence that Egyptians had bound their entire political and cosmic system to sexual ritual was intolerable. Giovanni Belzoni, one of the first to explore Egyptian tombs in the early 1800s, ordered explicit murals plastered over rather than recorded. Flinders Petrie, a founding figure in modern Egyptology, admitted to burning papyri he deemed obscene. Museums quietly created secret collections, accessible only to select male scholars. For over a century, the true Egypt, the Egypt of sacred sexuality and bodily alteration, was hidden under layers of plaster, censorship, and shame. And yet, the evidence refused to disappear. In 1925, Howard Carter's team, still basking in the glory of uncovering Tutankhamun's tomb, made a discovery that shook Egyptology. As they examined the boy king's body, they realized his genitals were missing. Not destroyed by time. Not decayed. Surgically removed. The cuts were precise, deliberate, and bore the marks of having been performed immediately after death, as part of the embalming process. His body had been coated in a strange resin that appeared to have combusted during burial, further disfiguring his remains. At first, explanations were timid. Perhaps decay. Perhaps accidental damage? But as more royal mummies were studied with modern methods, X-rays, CT scans, the pattern became undeniable. Tutankhamun was not alone. Other pharaohs showed evidence of genital removal. Some had been castrated. Others had undergone alterations that seemed designed to exaggerate masculine form even in death. This was not desecration. It was ritual. The most chilling case came not from a pharaoh, but from a prince of the 18th dynasty. His mummy revealed that the mutilation had been performed not after death, but before. Bone tissue showed signs of trauma consistent with a living wound. The boy had been altered alive, sacrificed to a theology that demanded his body be transformed for eternal service. Suddenly, cryptic phrases from Egyptian texts took on new meaning. Phrases about making the body more perfect, or closing the gate of manhood, were not metaphorical, they were instructions. This was not merely embalming. It was surgical theology. A reshaping of flesh for the afterlife, justified as divine necessity. To a modern audience, The implications are staggering. If Egyptians did this routinely to their royal dead, what might they have demanded of their living? Was mutilation a preparation for eternity, or was it also a living practice, inflicted on those expected to serve gods and pharaohs alike? This is where the comparisons sharpen the horror. In Mesopotamia, eunuchs guarded harems and temples, their mutilation framed as service to the state. In imperial China, castration became a ticket to power in court politics, at the cost of a body permanently marked. Among certain tribal societies, ritual scarification or mutilation served as proof of devotion. But Egypt was different. For Egypt, mutilation was not only political or social. It was cosmic. It was a way to realign a body with divine order, no matter the cost. And so, for centuries, priests, embalmers, and rulers colluded to reshape flesh in the name of eternity. What horrified Carter's team in 1925 was not an anomaly, but a glimpse into a systematic practice. What horrified Victorian archaeologists was not simply indecency, but the realization that one of the world's greatest civilizations had thrived on principles entirely at odds with their own sanitized image of history. The cover-up lasted more than a century, and in some ways continues today. Many museums still keep explicit artifacts in storage, sanitized exhibitions presenting Egypt as gold and stone, never blood and flesh. But the truth whispers from the bodies themselves, from the cut marks on Tutankhamun's corpse, from the trauma etched in the bones of the prince who died screaming, from the texts that described mutilation as purification. And this raises the question that no embalmer, no archaeologist, no priest could ever answer without shuddering. If the kings and princes of Egypt could be carved into compliance even after death, what of the children born into temples, the slaves purchased as sacred property, the living flesh offered in the name of gods? The answer, as we'll see, was worse than the silence of any tomb. If mutilating the dead was justified as perfecting the body for eternity, then the treatment of the living, especially children, was nothing short of catastrophic. In Egypt, the body was never entirely your own. It belonged to the gods, to the pharaoh, to the priesthood. Nowhere was this more brutally evident than in the lives of children born into privilege or captivity. From the earliest dynasties, elite families pledged their youngest sons and daughters to temple service. On papyrus contracts, this was dressed in glowing terms. The child was chosen, their family favored. But beneath the rhetoric lay a system of ritualized abuse. Children as young as 6 or 7 were taken into the temples, stripped not only of their freedom but of their very sense of self. They were drilled to believe their bodies were not their own, but instruments of cosmic energy, tools to be used in ceremonies that would ensure the Nile's flooding and the kingdom's survival. Training was relentless. Ancient medical papyri describe the consequences in stark, clinical language: dislocated joints, torn muscles, pelvic injuries. Children were bent and bound to increase flexibility so they could perform ritual positions on command. They were deliberately underfed to preserve a smaller, childlike form, believed to be closer to purity. Many wasted away before reaching adolescence. Others suffered injuries that crippled them for life. Archaeological evidence suggests that nearly 3/4 of temple children never reached adulthood, succumbing to infection, exhaustion, or sheer physical trauma. Yet the system was self-reinforcing. Priests told parents they were blessed if their child was selected. Families believed their sacrifice secured divine favor, both in this world and the next. To resist was to risk cosmic punishment. And so parents handed over sons and daughters, consoling themselves with the lie that this was honor, not horror. The abuse was not confined to temples. In private homes, domestic slaves, many of them children captured in wars or sold along trade routes, were commodified in ways that are almost unbearable to read. Surviving legal documents list the ages and physical traits of slaves in the same breath as livestock. Some contracts explicitly identify uses, marking out boys and girls for sexual service. The younger the slave, the higher their value. Purity was priced, youth was currency. For those who survived into adulthood, the psychological scars were immense. Ancient texts describe individuals who became hollow, unable to form normal bonds. Others were described as possessed by insatiable urges, compulsively reenacting what had been forced upon them. To a modern eye, these are the marks of trauma, dissociation, hypersexuality, depression. Egypt had no such words. Instead, they called it the touch of the divine, a cruel euphemism for what we would recognize as psychological collapse. And always, theology justified it. Priests proclaimed that sexual service was the highest form of worship, that a child given to the temple was chosen, not condemned. They wove doctrine around suffering, sanctifying exploitation as holy obligation. In their sermons, violation became blessing, torment became honor. Families were told not to grieve but to rejoice. This is how abuse became institutionalized, hidden behind ritual, wrapped in liturgy, framed as cosmic necessity. The economics of the system made it even more insidious. Wealthy patrons paid extraordinary sums for access to trained temple children. Records show that ceremonies could last 6 hours or more, with multiple children subjected to a single worshipper's demands. What was sold as devotion to the gods was, in practice, an industry. Organized, profitable, and sustained for millennia. It is tempting to imagine Egypt as an outlier, but history offers grim parallels. In Mesoamerica, Aztec priests sacrificed children to Tlaloc, the rain god, believing their tears would bring storms. In Rome, Vestal virgins were bound to decades of enforced chastity, with transgressors buried alive. In the Andes, Incan rituals demanded children be left to freeze on mountaintops as offerings. Yet, Egypt was different in one crucial way. Other societies killed or consecrated children. Egypt kept them alive to be used, over and over, turning their bodies into living instruments of ritual. Foreigners who glimpsed this system were appalled. Mesopotamian scribes hinted darkly at Egyptian decadence. Later Greek writers described rites so shocking they refused to record details. They saw in Egypt a contradiction, the greatest monuments of human achievement built upon the suffering of its most vulnerable. And always, the logic circled back to the Nile. If floods failed or crops withered, priests demanded more. More ceremonies, more training, more children offered up to serve as channels of divine energy. In years of famine, the cruelty only deepened. Egypt doubled down on its rituals, convincing itself that salvation required ever greater sacrifice of flesh and spirit. And yet, as horrifying as the temple system was, it still operated under boundaries. Ceremonies confined to sacred spaces, hierarchies enforced, order maintained. Once a year, even those boundaries dissolved. Once a year, the entire society, priests, nobles, slaves, children, was swept up in a sanctioned delirium that turned Egypt into something unrecognizable. It was called the Feast of Drunkenness. And compared to what happened then, the temple system almost looks restrained. If the temple system was a slow cruelty disguised as ritual order, the Feast of Drunkenness was a storm, a sanctioned delirium that consumed Egypt from palace to village, erasing every boundary, every law, every restraint. For 7 days and nights, the world turned upside down, and what the temples performed in private became a frenzy acted out in public by an entire civilization. Its roots lay in myth. The story told of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war, who once set out to annihilate humanity. To stop her bloodlust, the gods poured out beer tinted with red ochre across the land, tricking her into thinking it was blood. She drank until she was insensate, her rage dissolved, and in her place arose Hathor, the gentle goddess of love, music, and fertility. The myth was one of salvation, humankind spared through intoxication. But ritualized year after year, salvation twisted into excess. What began as remembrance of mercy devolved into chaos sanctified as holy. Months of preparation went into the festival. Temples brewed enormous stores of beer, stronger than daily drink, often laced with psychoactive extracts from the blue lotus and other plants. This was not simply alcohol, it was hallucinogenic, euphoric, disorienting. When the festival began, Egyptians believed themselves possessed by the gods. The barrier between mortal and divine collapsed, and anything done in that state was beyond judgment. Once the first cups were raised, order dissolved. Masters coupled with slaves in the open. Married women abandoned husbands and children to join strangers. Groups of drunken revelers stormed through homes, dragging residents into the frenzy. Children, barely old enough to understand, were forced to watch or even participate. Priests declared that in this intoxicated state, every act was holy. Violence became offering, violation became communion, madness became worship. Ancient descriptions are unflinching. Men competed to prolong their arousal until their bodies tore. Women were attacked in mobs, their suffering praised as divine blessing. Revelers scratched, bit, struck one another, leaving wounds considered marks of favor. Some collapsed in the streets, bloodied but exalted. Others died outright, trampled underfoot in the crush of drunken crowds, or ruptured by the violence of acts too brutal to imagine. And through it all, the priests encouraged. If Sekhmet had once drunk the land to save humanity, then Egyptians must drink and enact frenzy to maintain cosmic balance. To refuse was to defy the gods. The scale was staggering. Cities shut down. Work halted. Agricultural labor ceased. For a week, Egypt became a carnival of intoxication. And yet, this was not an accident. It was policy. Pharaohs tolerated, even encouraged, the festival because it served a purpose. It was a pressure valve. For 1 week, slaves mocked masters, the poor ransacked homes, women stepped outside patriarchal control. By allowing reversal, the hierarchy could reassert itself with greater force once the festival ended. The cost was immense. Families were destroyed, trust shattered. Some participants awoke afterward unable to remember what they had done, horrified by the evidence on their bodies. Children born 9 months later carried stigma as children of the festival, whispered about as offspring of divine possession rather than legitimate union. But still, the feast returned year after year, because priests swore it kept the world in balance. Foreigners were aghast. Mesopotamian envoys described Egyptians as civilized only in stone. Greek travelers compared the feast to barbarism masked as religion. Some courts even refused to send diplomats to Egypt during festival months, fearing for their safety. Yet within Egypt, it was sacred duty. To outsiders, madness; to Egyptians, cosmic necessity. Archaeological evidence confirms what texts describe. Excavations at temple complexes have revealed chambers clearly designed for group sexual activity. Stone benches, drainage systems for bodily fluids, walls marked by damage from violence. These were not hidden alcoves, but integrated into temple architecture, proof that what we might call chaos was, to them, sacred design. Anthropologists compare the Feast of Drunkenness to other festivals of reversal. The Roman Saturnalia allowed slaves to dine with masters. Medieval Europe celebrated the Feast of Fools, when clerics mocked bishops. But those were parody, carnival, release. Egypt's festival was darker. It was not comedy but brutality, not satire but sanctification. Where others played at reversal, Egypt turned it into blood-soaked ritual. And yet, for all its violence, the festival endured for centuries. Because beneath the chaos was a logic. If humanity had once been saved by intoxication, then Egypt must reenact intoxication to keep the world safe. If Sekhmet had once relented, then Hathor must be honored with the very excess that had calmed her. But not everyone could tolerate it. When foreigners seized Egypt's throne, they faced the same question: could they allow this madness to continue? The Greeks recoiled. The Romans were appalled. And their attempts to suppress the feast would ignite the slow death of Egyptian religion itself. The Feast of Drunkenness had endured for centuries, but it was not eternal. When the Ptolemies seized Egypt after Alexander's conquest, they inherited not only a kingdom of monuments and wealth but also a religion anchored in sacred chaos. For Greek rulers raised on rational philosophy, the sight of priests sanctioning drunken violence and ritual abuse was almost unthinkable. And yet, to refuse participation meant losing legitimacy. Pharaohs, even foreign ones, had to prove their devotion by joining Egypt's rites. Cleopatra, I was among the first to attempt reform. She shortened the festival, limited public displays of sexuality, and tried to frame it as symbolic rather than literal. The priests were outraged. When floods failed or armies faltered, they declared it divine punishment for her interference. The message was clear: tamper with the feast, and Egypt itself would collapse. Her descendant Cleopatra III faced an even sharper dilemma. By then, Rome's influence loomed large. Roman officials were scandalized by Egyptian rituals, denouncing them as evidence of moral decay. Yet priests threatened rebellion if the festivals were abandoned. Cleopatra III crafted a compromise, toned down modest rituals for Roman eyes, while private chambers in temples still hosted the extremes demanded by tradition. But this satisfied no one. To Egyptians, she was betraying the gods. To Romans, she remained tainted by barbarism. Hypocrisy eroded both authority and faith. The tension reached its breaking point with Rome's conquest in 30 BCE. When Augustus entered Egypt, he encountered temples adorned with explicit art, papyri describing rituals of violence, and chambers designed for group intoxication. To him, this was not religion but corruption. He ordered an immediate purge. Priests who resisted were executed. Ritual texts were burned. Temples were stripped of explicit carvings. For the first time in millennia, Egypt's sacred chaos was silenced, not by famine or rebellion, but by imperial decree. But suppression came at a terrible cost. Generations of children raised as temple vessels suddenly found themselves without purpose. They had been conditioned from birth to see their value only in service. With that service outlawed, they were left adrift. Roman records describe suicides among former temple children, others turning to underground cults that tried to resurrect forbidden rites. Trauma rippled through society. An entire cultural framework, sexuality as cosmic order, had been ripped away overnight. Yet even Rome could not erase everything. Some cults survived in secret. Others left traces in architecture, in art, in fragments of papyri buried beneath sand. Centuries later, when European explorers rediscovered Egypt, they encountered this evidence, and recoiled just as violently as Augustus had. The 19th century marked a second erasure, this time not by empire but by morality. Victorian archaeologists, heirs to a society that prized propriety above truth, found themselves unable to accept what they saw. Giovanni Belzoni in 1817 discovered tomb paintings filled with explicit sexual imagery. Rather than document them, he covered them in plaster and published accounts describing beautiful religious scenes. Flinders Petrie confessed in his journals that he destroyed artifacts he considered too obscene, burning papyri, smashing statues. Museums built entire systems of concealment. The British Museum created special collections, accessible only to select male scholars. The Louvre and the Cairo Museum followed suit, locking explicit artifacts in basements. Even translations were censored. The Great Ebers Papyrus, a medical text, contained dozens of sections on sexuality. Victorian translators excised them, replacing direct words with euphemisms or omitting them entirely. For more than a century, the world saw only a sanitized Egypt, pyramids, pharaohs, and gold, stripped of flesh and blood. The cover-up persists even today. The British Museum alone holds thousands of Egyptian artifacts mislabeled as miscellaneous or decorative, their true nature hidden. As recently as 2019, newly discovered papyri were quietly withheld from public display. Even digital platforms like Wikipedia struggle. Entries on Egyptian sexuality often locked from editing, sanitized for general audiences. What began as Victorian prudery lingers as modern censorship. The consequence is profound. By suppressing this evidence, we lose not only the darker truths of Egypt but also an understanding of how power, faith, and the body intertwine in human history. Egypt's rituals reveal how religion can sanctify cruelty, how sexuality can be transformed into cosmic obligation, how entire societies can normalize violence when it is framed as sacred. To hide these truths is to repeat the very silencing that began with Augustus and continued under Victorian scholars. For 3,000 years, Egyptians believed sex held the cosmos together. For another 2,000, conquerors and curators buried the evidence. But the whispers remain, in mutilated mummies, in damaged papyri, in the scars left on the bodies of children who never had a voice. Behind the golden masks and towering pyramids lies another Egypt, one built on rituals of flesh, on sanctioned violence, on devotion that devoured its own. This is not the Egypt in schoolbooks or museum tours. But it is Egypt all the same. And to remember, it is to see history not as marble statues and heroic kings, but as fragile human lives caught in systems that sanctified their suffering. Which part of this dark history shocked you most? Tell me in the comments. Press like if you want more, and subscribe so you're here when we reveal the next hidden chapter.